Well, thank you guys for your time. Thanks to the attendees who have already joined, and it's starting to fill up pretty quick. Hello everyone and welcome. I hope you're all safe and healthy. We have a lot of content to cover today, so let's just get right into it. For those of you still working from home, your children and dogs are welcome, and in fact encouraged to submit questions via the Q&A box during the session. Now, I'm familiar with a lot of the people who are joining today, but for those new folks, I'm Isaac Brown, Associate Partner here at Landmark Ventures, and we're here today to discuss digital transformation. Honestly, I'm going tone deaf to the term. It means everything and nothing, but whatever it means, I think we can all agree it's important to get it right. So to that end, we've assembled a panel with a couple industry stalwarts from UST and Forrester. Earlier this year, UST commissioned Forrester Consulting to survey hundreds of global executives across multiple industries to pin down the hallmarks of a digitally mature organization, really to identify what distinguishes the digitally advanced versus the beginners and those in the middle of their journey. And over the course of this session today, we're going to discuss some of the key findings from that study. The panel discussion is going to run about 30 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A after that. Over the course of the session, I encourage all the audience to submit questions via the Q&A box at any time, and we'll try and cover them at the end. Now, I want to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. We've got Trent Mayberry, Chief Digital Officer at UST. Trent is an industry thought leader, author, and expert on digital transformation. And for those that may not know, UST is a digital technology partner to Global 1,000 companies. And we've got guest speaker Nigel Fenwick, VP and Principal Analyst of Digital Transformation and Business Strategy at Forrester. Nigel is going to be providing some insights from the UST commissioned digital maturity study in our conversation today. Now, guys, let's just do a couple quick intros, 30 seconds each. Trent, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think you introduced me. I'm Chief Digital Officer here at UST, based in Chicago. I work across multiple industries, and it's been a really exciting year with COVID and the challenges. I no longer have the question, should we do digital, but how quickly? So excited to be here.
Great. Thanks, Trent. Nigel?
Yeah, hi. So I cover digital transformation strategy at Forrester, as you mentioned, and really what I do is try and bring a view on how to use technology to drive revenue growth, building on my career and as a consultant, as a CIO at Reebok for a number of years, and also leading marketing for a software company, blending all of those things together to help clients understand how to leverage technology to drive revenue growth. That's a key component of digital transformation. And so that's my role at Forrester.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Now, I want to just jump right into it. So let's start with a big picture question, right? We've been talking about digital transformation for years. And with COVID, kind of like you said, Trent, everybody's been more focused on digital. But, given how long it's been going on for and how many resources have been poured into it, why do companies still struggle with digital transformation? Nigel, you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We've been talking about this for a long time. And there are companies that struggle with it, and the companies that are doing very well with it. It's not typically any one thing. I mean, the companies that struggle, they typically focus more of their efforts on things that can be, I would probably describe them as tactical bolt-on sort of enhancements to things like customer experiences, a lot of modernization of the existing business model. And that's, something we've been seeing for years. The companies that do better are thinking a lot more strategically about how they think about technology to create customer value and then drive revenue growth as a result of that. So that's one of the key differences. Another factor is sort of the underlying technology architecture of the business. To be effective in using technology to create those new sources of value for customers, firms typically need to build on a very flexible, adaptable kind of technology architecture. And unfortunately, instead of modernizing those core applications, many of the firms that struggle are really sort of effectively, they're just kicking that proverbial can down the road, right? They're simply running out of road. I mean, there's only so far they can keep doing that without actually impacting the business. And then probably the third factor really comes down to the skill sets that the organizations have. We know that we've been seeing a dramatic skills shortage around digital, data scientists, AI. And so, being able to build up those skills in the organization is a challenge. And so companies have invested in building up the kinds of digital skills and digital thinking they need to accelerate and be effective in the business. Those ones that have done that early have got a head start. And the companies that are lagging behind in that, they're struggling to find the kind of talent they need to really accelerate forward at this point in time.
Agree, Nigel. And skills and culture is obviously one of the key themes of this discussion, and we're going to come back to that. But Trent, I want to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, and I think, I guess the first comment I make is that digital to me is a combination of business strategy and technology strategy joined together. And I think in the last year, a lot of people have just gone into survival mode as a company and invested a lot of technology and investments in, digital that's really been about keeping the lights on. But I think there's an opportunity here to fundamentally shift and rethink the business strategy. And I think that's been slower for a lot of companies. In our survey, we distinguish between the companies that are really doing digital well and the companies that are still really starting out, between beginners and advanced, if you will. And we noticed that only about 50% of the companies actually had a defined digital strategy that really articulated where they were going as a business. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I think Nigel's comment's right, that those that are succeeding are focusing on customer lifetime value. And that is really a representation that you're constantly evolving to meet the needs of your customers. And I think that's quite powerful. That's having a big implication on experience. We've seen the last couple of years where companies have invested in customer experience. Over the past year and a half, we've seen a need to really invest in employee experience, because employee experience is actually a fundamental influencer on customer experience, and that's quite powerful. I would also say this: the business rules have fundamentally changed. I mean, COVID put us in a position where, a lot of companies saw things that were non-core all of a sudden became very important. At the same time, we're also seeing changes in the industry, like changes in privacy rules. And that's going to call into question a lot of things around what we traditionally think of as digital marketing, and rethink that. So I think there's a lot of changes still evolving, and the companies that are succeeding are going to be ones that continue to adapt that digital strategy in line with those changes.
And I really agree with the point about not just focusing on customer experience, but also really enhancing employee experience, especially over the last year and a half. We've seen a tremendous investment in that across every industry with remote work and staffing constraints. So I think when we see that continue to grow. I want to go back to the study. I know that you tried to categorize companies based on where they were in the hierarchy of digital maturity. What did the study tend to show for digital leaders? I know that you were able to show a lot of key differences between beginner, intermediate, and advanced firms. How did you do that assessment, and what did you find in the data? Nigel, you want to share some thoughts on that?
So, I mean, we start out, we surveyed over 400, global decision makers, really, to understand what's going on in the business. We looked at a number of factors that are really leading indicators of digital maturity. We've been tracking this for years. We kind of know what to look for and the questions to ask. And those really try to determine how the more advanced firms differ from the less advanced firms. And the factors are things like, how much a firm focuses on improving the customer experience and improving employee experiences, to Trent's point. How effective they are at creating business agility, to be able to respond to changes in the market. How adaptable the technology is to be able to build those new experiences. How well they develop a partner ecosystem. All of these things come together to really shape a digital maturity sort of perspective for a company. And then we sort of break that down to see it so we can see beginner, intermediate, advanced firms. And there's some really interesting differences between those advanced and beginner groups. And it's really sort of when you tease those apart, understand what the advanced firms are doing differently, that it really gets kind of insightful. So one of the things we found is that despite a focus on creating sort of a customer and employee value, the advanced firms also saw savings in operational expenses as a result of the investments they're making in digital transformation. In fact, all of the companies in the advanced group saw those savings. But whereas the beginner firms, they tend to focus more on cost savings, actually they don't all get cost savings. So only 73% of the beginner firms get those cost savings. So despite not focusing on cost savings, the advanced firms are getting them. The beginner firms that are focused on cost savings are not always getting those cost savings, or not to the extent that they see them. That's a pretty big difference. And then we look at the sort of the customer growth, particularly in 2020. We know it was a tough year. The advanced firms really saw a growth rate over 11% compared to the beginner firms. The beginner firms actually saw typically a negative growth rate, -2% for beginner firms. So a big delta between advanced firms who were set up to come into the pandemic, they were really operationally set up to be much more effective as a digital business. Whereas the laggard firms, the companies that are sort of a bit further behind, really struggle to get their act together in many cases, or just to keep the lights on and keep employees sort of working because they didn't have that infrastructure and operational services set up to support a digital business. Advanced firms are much more likely to be growing at a faster rate than beginner firms. And when we think about coming out of the pandemic, this is really critical too, right? So the digitally mature firms can accelerate out of the pandemic much faster than the companies that have been struggling with their growth rate for the last 12 months. So there's a lot of different insights we've picked up in the research, a lot of great data points in that research that I think is worth pulling out. So I encourage people to go take a look at that for sure.
And Nigel, I may add just a couple things with that. I think when I look at some of the differences around intermediate or beginners and advanced companies, I think the other element was taking a look at the culture and the investment in the culture. The advanced firms are more likely and more open to encourage a bit of experimentation and learning and risk than we've seen in the beginner firms. I think that starts to come through in terms of the culture, the way they make decisions, the way that they're actually incorporating and challenging their own business models.
Yep, for sure. Culture is one of the number one barriers we see to effective transformation, and actually figuring out how to overcome that is a big challenge for many firms.
Agreed. I actually want to interject one of the questions somebody put here in the chat because I think it flows nicely with the narrative here. What are the key mindsets that distinguish leaders who successfully lead their companies through digital transformation and those that struggle? Because obviously a lot of this comes down to leadership. And then a big piece of it, as we see, is kind of selling it up and down the org chart because you need adoption from the entire company. So given that it starts with leadership driving digital strategy, you guys have any thoughts around what distinguishes successful leaders?
Well, I can tell you that year after year and all the data that we look at, the most successful companies are CEO driven in terms of their thinking about how to use technology to drive revenue growth for customers. So there's part of it is that understanding that technology has a strategic component. The other factor in this that we see commonly across the leaders is an obsession about creating customer value. So we describe these companies as being customer obsessed because the CEO is hyper focused on the customer. They're less focused on the competitors and much more focused on what does the customer want? What are their evolving expectations? How can we create value for customers? How can we do something different to help customers get to what they want to get to? How can we improve the products and services we provide? How do we change the employee experiences to make sure that we're providing value for customers? So the CEO has that vision about being customer obsessed, and then that trickles down through the leadership team. And very often it's we talk about a digital mindset. That's also partly of looking at the metrics that you're using to measure employee success and making sure that the metrics are all aligned around customer outcomes. And that reflects that obsession about creating customer value. So those are some of the big things that I see year in, year out. Trent, do you have any perspectives from what you see?
I think you're absolutely right. And when you talk about customer value, I think there's a fundamental shift from moving away from selling products and services to selling to needs. And that means in some cases, companies have had to open up and start to curate partners who can actually help fulfill a need. So they're no longer in that pure product or service mindset. That's changing the experience journeys they're offering to their customers, to their employees. It means that they can actually cross-sell multiple products and services to meet a need. And they're using data to sense those changes and needs over time so that they can actually tweak their products and change. And that's one of the things the startup companies have done very well, is using data in every decision. We're seeing large organizations start to do that well as well.
No, that's great. Thanks guys. And I've seen like 3 questions just now about where can we get the details from that study. I can follow up with anybody after the session today to make sure you get connected with the right people for that. So feel free to just ping me. So back to the discussion here. What are successful digitally mature organizations doing differently than the ones that seem to struggle? Trent, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this one. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Nigel touched on it early, getting out of just cost savings and into a growth and a value enhancement mindset. I think that's a big difference. I think taking a look at design beyond being a front end problem and starting to take a look at it as an end-to-end journey for the customer to help them better understand their own needs, to actually carry that all the way through to supporting them and giving them insight at the point of need. I think that's advanced firms are much more effective at baking design throughout the whole process, not only the front end, but also redesigning their back end services, taking a look at automation in terms of how can I use automation to provide insight to my employees that can service the customers really at the point of need. And that's a whole evolution around experience and journey design that we're seeing very powerful.
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up on that, Trent, because design is one of those components I think a lot of firms either underestimate or just simply don't have enough design capability. I see it a lot in the product management research I'm doing, looking at how firms are developing new digital products, and a lot of times they lack that design capability, and I think it applies equally to designing employee experiences as well. I'd also like to just highlight, maybe some of the things that we saw in the survey, some of those differences, Isaac, to help highlight that. I mean, certainly the biggest difference we saw is how they approach this creation of customer value. 94% of the advanced respondents have been connecting transformation investments to changes in lifetime value for at least the last year. And that's significantly different from beginners, where the focus is more typically on cost containment, as I mentioned earlier. So that's one big difference, right? So cost containment versus how do we create value for customers. Another big difference is that advanced firms are much more likely to be taking this enterprise-wide view that Trent just mentioned. It's how they can actually use technology to create that value for customers across the enterprise. In other words, they see technology as a strategic tool rather than something that they needs to be sort of parceled out to, say, individual departments or business units piecemeal based on budget. It's this strategic view of the enterprise and how we create value for customers across the enterprise. The advanced firms are also sort of making sure that they're measuring the right things. I touched on metrics just before, but really identifying those leading indicators of customer value and connecting softer metrics like employee satisfaction to the impact on the customer experience. So metrics does play a huge part in this. And I talk to a lot of customers that are they sometimes struggle with, well, what are the right metrics to measure? What are the leading indicators of lifetime value? And these are all things that, to your point, Trent, about being data obsessed and using data to help influence, using the right metrics is really critical to helping push the envelope in terms of creating value for customers.
I want to dig into that a little bit, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but when you talk about metrics, you said one thing a few minutes ago that I thought was really interesting around tying transformation efforts to life cycle growth, right? Actually, like tying those things together. When you talk about these metrics and these touch points, how do companies implement those? Right? Like what does that actually look like logistically?
So there's, when you guys say how to influence, I mean, there's one is actually understanding which metrics to start with. So if you're doing product development, you're typically looking for leading indicators of customer value. So you can look at revenue for sure and product sales, but a lot of times with the digital components, we're now looking at things like how not only how much is the customer using the digital services or products, but also how engaged they are, and whether or not whether you can actually measure outcome value. And sometimes you have to think about, well, actually, there's the more they're using this digital service, an indicator of value or actually an indicator of less value. Sometimes, like if you're spending more time opening a bank account, that's actually not a good thing. You want them to be able to open a bank account very quickly. So engagement there is actually a poor sign of value because you want it to be as tight as possible. Sometimes you're building products where you want maximum engagement. So if you think about financial services, let's say a digital planning tool, well, their customers engaged using the digital planning tool is a sign that they're getting value from it. So understanding these leading indicators of value are really critical to that. And then once you have those metrics, obviously baselining where those current experiences are, comparing the baseline metrics to say customers are engaged on digital services with customers that are not engaged, so you can actually start to track their revenue and lifetime value that flows out of those two different experiences. and then tuning the digital experiences to help improve the value perception. That means constantly doing discovery with customers on an ongoing basis, not just doing, okay, once a year when we think about doing a project. It's every week we're talking to customers, understanding how they're using products and services, what they can do, what we can do to improve that user experience. All of that leads to tuning the metrics we're using and measuring in terms of perceptions of value for the customer. The same goes with employee experiences too, right? Measuring how employees are using their digital services across the business, whether those services are actually helping them do something that's valuable for their job and serving the customers. So all of these things come together in that respect.
I want to pick up on the metrics around customer experience, employee experience. There are now tools that help you do that. And CXM, EXM. We're also starting to see people measure partner experience management, because if you're going to deliver to needs, you have to understand how your partners are interacting to fulfill that need as well. But that's a data-driven model. So when we look at the beginners, I think they're pretty comfortable at measuring top line growth, cost savings, things that are classic ROI. But the advanced companies are not only looking at those customer touch points and the CXM and EXM stuff, they're also taking a look at resiliency factors. They're taking a look at how quickly, when we detect a signal in market, we can actually respond to that. That's a responsiveness model. We're starting to see measures around culture. How well are we imbibing this culture of risk-taking and innovation? And those are factors that the advanced firms were measuring much more consistently. Beginner firms were struggling to say, I don't even know how to measure that. The advanced firms are saying, well, we've got a baseline now. Let's detect and track our actions against those metrics. So there were pretty big differences that way.
Yeah, we're starting to see firms put in sort of those digital platforms for, like, culture is your great point, Trent. I mean, if you're going to change culture, you gotta have to understand where we're at today and where do we want to get to. And that's not about what the leadership perception of the customer is, but it's actually about the frontline employee perception of culture is. And then how do we actually want to evolve that culture? So how do we get sensing the employee perception around how the culture is changing and gathering that data on a digital platform is a tool that a lot of firms are starting to embrace, particularly for large workforces.
Yeah, go ahead, Trent.
Well, Isaac, I noticed in a few of the questions, this question about industry agnostic and business cycle maturity in terms of this digital mindset. And I guess the good news, my observation, every industry is actually wrestling with this problem. I've seen that digitally, consistent industries like financial services, they don't sell physical products, they sell digital projects. We're early entrants to that point. But we're seeing them, obviously continue that progress, and they're realizing that providing more channels is not necessarily creating more value. They have to instead use those analytics to say, how do I provide better insight and better advice to my customers to drive a better engagement and a better customer lifetime value? And so they're evolving. If I look in retail, we've had a lot of cases where e-commerce exploded in the last year and a half, but people are starting to take a look at buy online, pick up in stores. How do I engage my customers before they ever come to my physical store? How do I get my employees use digital to actually make my employees feel safer and feel more productive in the environments? We're seeing this across industries. So every industry is leveraging that. If you take a look at manufacturing, we've seen digital twins and IoT capabilities starting to come in, saying, again, how do I use data to start to embed in every decision I need to make? So it's not an industry specific set of discussions. Those mindsets are all about, how do I get the right experience to my customers and my employees? How do I use data to make sure those are insightful and personalized sets of experiences at the point of need? And how do I start to leverage all this capability I've got across my organization in a way that's efficient and effective for my customers? And that is a mindset that crosses industries.
Yeah, I'd add to that there are obviously some industry accelerators. So I think that was your point about financial services, retail, Trent, that that there's some components where the customer is really forcing that change. So kind of what people describe as a burning platform. That tends to accelerate the need to have that digital mindset. But there are examples of leaders in every industry that are thinking about, how do we use technology to create value? And that to me is kind of a broader digital mindset. So again, there's this perception of I see different interpretations of how to define digital. So some people will think of digital as, okay, it's just like e-commerce, or it's just digital marketing, or maybe it's just building digital experiences. And then there's other people who have a much broader perspective about digital. It's about how do we use technology to really change the way we create value and differentiate the business. So that's creating customer value. It's maybe extracting value in terms of operational cost, particularly in things like commodities, right? So mining companies are using AI and data to really understand how to create a more highly efficient operationally mine to extract more ore, say, for if it's ore mining per employee and per dollar invested, and because that's the way they're going to make their margins. They can't differentiate on customer experience because it's a commodity. So we're seeing it different across different industries, but this ability to think about using technology as a tool to create value, whether it's through cost extraction or revenue generation or profitability, to create value as opposed to just a tool to operationalize the business. And that's the big shift. I mean, the shift really is about, you go back 10 years and companies were primarily looking at technology as a way to just create operational efficiency and try to just run the business as efficiently as possible. Now we're looking at how to use those emerging technologies to really differentiate the business and create competitive advantage. It's a big mindset shift.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about some of the examples I've seen. I guess with digital, I've also seen small and medium companies be able to compete more effectively against the very large companies, which has been great. But they've often had lesser investments in the past in the digital space. We had one small retailer in India where at the strike of COVID, they had to actually, move away from having all of their purchases be done in store. And so in a couple of weeks, we had to actually help them set up an e-commerce based capability that allowed them to continue to sell their products. But one of the things we added was, tell me about the people that you like or respect from a fashion perspective. And they started using that insight to help customers better find products that met their needs, but it also helped them start to understand what are some of the demand changes that are happening out in market. So we're seeing that social listening start to create new data sources that can help you forecast demand. It can help you anticipate new product needs, et cetera. And that's kind of interesting. I've seen the payments companies who've spent a lot of time focusing on point of sale and efficient payment, et cetera, starting to expand their services, saying, hey, companies now need help with how do I run my business? How do I run my payroll? How do I get my supply chain working? And we're starting to see this expansion of services beyond I guess the traditional service lines that they've got. I've also seen banks start to say, let's create marketplaces that help people not only buy our products, but potentially find a new home or find a new car or connect with other buyers. And those are ancillary services we're starting to see emerge. So there are lots of great examples where people are using digital to really change their business model.
Yep.
Absolutely. I think that's some great insight. So I just want to add one thing to it, and then I want to switch over to Q&A mode because we've got a lot of great questions. So to anyone in the audience that wants to submit a question, feel free to do so, and we'll try and cover it in the next 15 minutes. We get asked the industry question a lot: which industries are leading, or which regions are leading, or which company sizes are leading. And I don't really think there's an answer to that, right? I think depending on who you talk to, different industries seem to be ahead. I have a lot of phone calls where I get on the phone with somebody to talk about digital innovation, and they start the call by saying, my industry is really far behind. And I think almost every call that I have starts that way. Everyone seems to think that, but I think everyone could use a little help with digital transformation. So I like this one question I see here, and I want to start with this one. Does digital transformation ever end?
Well, so this comes back to the definition. If you define digital transformation as a shift from a traditional business, selling traditional products or services, to sort of evolving to much more of a creating value and selling digital services, and essentially transitioning to a software company business model, then that transformation does end. You become essentially a technology or hybrid technology company. So that if you define it like that, then that transformation would end, and then you can continuously evolve the business. if you define transformation as being using new technology to do things differently, sort of innovating, rethinking the way you're operating, then that transformation is never going to end. And that's one of the characteristics of a technology or software company. When you look at a software company and how they operate, they don't build a product and then sort of launch it and then go develop a new product and then replace that in 5 years. They build a product and evolve it continuously. And that's kind of the shift, right? The shift in the business model is going from one that's built on sort of product cycles to one that's a continuously evolving service that is using technology to create value for customers. And the operating model for that kind of business is very different. So that transformation is important to recognize. But the modernization of the business, using technology to modernize how you're operating the business, how you're creating value for customers, that modernization journey is continuous for sure.
And I think if you treat digital transformation as a project, I'm going to accomplish step A, B, and C, then certainly you can have a beginning and an end. The problem is that when you're done finishing A, B, and C, the customer needs have shifted, the market shifts needed, and now you need to do another program. So you get this continuous cycle. So the term digital transformation, in my mind, has been used as a proxy for projects. Then you get a continuous change because it's just change. But I think if you redefine digital transformation around, am I building a culture that can sense, respond, and adapt to change? Am I creating an operating model that allows that data to be embedded into my decisions? Then if you create a company like that, then your normal mode of business is to continue to adapt and evolve with your business needs. And then in that case, you've reached a state of building a company that can actually drive that. So it's not a program in that case, it's a changing culture. And that's where I think it's still very people-driven, very human-driven.
Yeah, this is a terrible analogy, but I'm going to share it anyways. I grew up outside New York, and we have this expression which is about always repainting the Tappan Zee Bridge. You start painting one side of it, and by the time you get to the other, there's a million versions of this, but by the time you get to the other side of it, you just got to start painting it again. So it's a cycle.
There's an equation I like to use to help people understand. It's particularly useful to help like CFO CEOs understand what's going on, the dynamic that's going on. Experience over expectations. Customer experience over customer expectations equals perceived value. And so if you think about that formula, if you just put a number in there, so 100 for customer experience, 100 for customer expectations. Sorry, expectations over experience. Experience over expectations. So you put 100 for each, you get a value of 1, right? So a lot of firms, what they do is they'll try and improve the experience. So they'll say, okay, well, it's going to move the experience up to say 200, and meanwhile the expectations, they'll stay at 100, and so we double the perceived value. So we go up to 2 in terms of perceived value. The reality of what's happening is the expectations are always going up. And so, if you're lucky, you get to 200 over 200, you still got a perceived value of 1. If you're unlucky, what happens is you invest in a project and you sort of build a new website, let's say, and so you say, okay, we'll go up to 200. But the customer's expectations are constantly going up. They're being reset by everybody else. And so, you finish that project and all of a sudden you see the expectations actually up at 300. Now you've actually got 200 over 300. You've got a reduction in perceived value. So the executives, what they look at is, we just spent all this money doing this project, and actually we're not seeing any improvement in terms of customer retention. And so that's a failure in their mind. And so this is how a lot of digital transformation gets characterized as failure, because it's not seen as the right strategy or the right approach in terms of execution and the expectations of the management team in terms of what's involved and how long it's going to take. And so you have that, if that's out of step, it really does actually reinforce that sort of laggard behavior where executives start to see, okay, well, we put all that money into that digital project and that didn't pay off. So we're reluctant to do it again. And they just end up being further and further behind. It's a real dilemma that executives have to grapple with. Understanding that you've got to meet these rising expectations as just part of today's go-to-market business model is a crucial factor in understanding the dynamics that are going on in the business today.
Well, I think, Nigel, you bring up a good point that, the biggest danger is standing still because things are constantly evolving. And you use that in the context of this evolving customer experience. I think more and more, it's also the employee experience. I know, the environments you go in where the employees are actually feeling under significant stress, and I feel a lot for the essential workers that have spent the last year and a half. They're tired. They're really overworked. They're feeling under supported. The companies that have actually invested in that wellness around employees have started to see real dividends in their employees starting to bring new ideas and new concepts to work, and they're translating that to energy for the customers. And that's, I think, increasing value for both parties. And the other thing I'd have to go back to is this whole ecosystem story. I think more and more companies are realizing that they would like to participate actively in ecosystems. And the term I often see is this platform company, the idea that if I can own a platform, I can assemble ecosystems to participate on my platform. The reality is a little bit more complicated than that. There will be companies that create a platform and invite their partners to come join it. But they, at the same time, that same company may need to join somebody else's ecosystem and therefore participate in somebody else's platform. And getting those two things merged together, I think, are going to be also essential predictors of success.
Yep.
No, that's a good one. So there's 2 more questions here that I want to cover, and then we'll wrap. I want to cover this one by Raj at New York Life. He said, "Great comments by Nigel and Trent," which I fully agree with. And you guys got cool names, you got great virtual backgrounds, just a great show all around. So thank you. The question is whether there is tangible evidence of digital transformation working, or is it simply a theme that has been over-exaggerated? Did the pandemic really drive significant pickup in IT spending and digital transformation? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Who wants to jump on that?
I'm going to jump in on this one because we just published an infographic on this. It's not part of the study we did, but the infographic we just published really digs into the transformation maturity and what companies have been spending over the last year. And we saw a huge increase in investment in the advanced firms. So yes, they spent more, and they targeted that spending on modernizing IT is one of the things they spent more on. And then the laggard firms, sort of the beginner firms, were typically spending less or staying about the same. And so that was a huge difference. And interestingly, the spend for the beginner firms tends to be much more around cost containment or say customer experience. So trying to improve customer experience, maybe putting some of those, like, if retail sort of order online, pickup in store kind of components that were essential for the last year. The advanced firms, because they got a lot of those basics in already, were much more likely to be looking at, okay, well, what's the thing that's holding us back next? And they've done a lot of the initial, what I would describe as the low-hanging fruit. So the customer experience kind of things they've already done. And they started to realize that there's implications, going back to your point, Trent, about employees and how employees operate and how they service and support the business, how they support creating value for customers. And they start to recognize that actually we need to change a lot of the underlying technology components. They're starting to hold us back. And so they've taken advantage of this moment to be able to go invest in paying down some of that technology debt to get rid of some of those legacy platforms, update them, move them to the cloud so they can enable that agility they need going forward. And so there's definitely, I would say, Raj, that we've seen this big shift in accelerated spend for advanced firms compared to the beginners. Absolutely clear delineation there.
Yeah, I agree. Certainly the spending's been healthy. I think the nature of how they're spending the money differs substantially. I've seen, I'll give you a compare and contrast. I've seen companies invest heavily in automation, both at the basic level and at the advanced level. I think at the basic level, what they're trying to automate is existing processes to hopefully reduce manual labor, which isn't a bad thing. But I think the advanced companies are taking a look at, how do I invest in automation to bring some new service or new capability or new insight to my customers? So, take a case where you have an automation to open an account that reduces the time it takes to open an account from, an hour down to 10 minutes. That's a good thing. But there's another investment in an automation that may say, let me also give you advice at the same time you're opening the account to say, here's the 3 things that you really need to pick in your next product set. That's now providing advice to the customer, not only about the administration of opening a product, but also which product's most suitable for you. That personalization is a very different quality of investment. So both are investing, but at different levels. I've seen the cloud investments, the beginners have focused mostly on just moving the applications to a different infrastructure. There's not as much value as once you've got something in the cloud, how am I connecting it and interconnecting it in a way that that information can be available at each one of my processes? So the nature of the investment is also shifting, I think. So good, healthy spending, but the quality of that spending can be very different.
And then I want to throw this one out there as a final question. So we just talked about did spend increase, and the answer is obviously yes. But did the ROI on that spend increase? And how do you measure that?
Well, the ROI is always the number one question I ask, right? So I ask of any vendor that we talk to in terms of the case examples that they give us is, okay, well, what is the business impact? And a lot of clients are, they're reluctant to actually give even the vendors that they're working with the hard ROI. They don't want to share their baseline numbers. The business impacts that we tend to see companies measure are things like they'll track direct revenue, so they'll look at revenue growth. They'll look at cost savings for sure. I mean, we mentioned that, and there are some public stories out there of companies that are showing hard and fast ROI metrics in terms of at least in terms of business impact, revenue growth metrics. You never get to see how much they're investing, right? So the numbers, like I mean, we see some of them, but they're under NDA. But the investment that they're making to get those returns is kind of one of the closely guarded secrets. This is why benchmarks is so hard. We get asked so many times, like, what's the benchmark in industry for a spend on, say, digital transformation? Well, first of all, you have to define what's digital transformation. And then secondly, it's like, okay, well, what are you throwing into that in terms of spend? I mean, do you count moving stuff from on-prem to the cloud as part of transformation? Is that part of the budget? So you can't, benchmarking is just like a fool's errand from a point of view of trying to figure out, are we spending enough? The enough is always, can you show the impact on the business? And if you try to still measure ROI from a point of view of a project ROI, I'm going to guarantee you're probably not going to succeed in the long run. You really need to be able to focus on, how do we bring all of these things together? So because you can't take technology and separate it from marketing. You can't separate it from how we provide customer service. You can't separate it from how we're delivering customer experience and looking at all the different support components. You have to look at the entire business end to end and see how you're creating value for customers and use that to drive the strategy for revenue growth. Trying to extract technology out of that, as we used to 10 or 15 years ago, is just, it's not going to work in today's business model. Technology is so intertwined that if you try and find the ROI on the technology investment, it's just impossible to unpack from everything else you're doing across the business. Companies are still going to try and do it because CFOs want it. There are some cases where you can show a good ROI, but if you take that approach, you're going to underinvest in a lot of spaces where you need to be making those investments.
I guess one thing I'd add to that, at least if I look from an expectations perspective, when I talk to my teams, I challenge them to think about, how do you get a 2 times or 10 times improvement in what you're doing? Don't think about a 5 or 10% improvement and think that's an attractive model. And so we're certainly see that opportunity in the expectations that you can go after a much better return as an important element. And I take a look at something like the investments in artificial intelligence and machine learning. A lot of companies have gone, I would say, very, very slow in experimenting with a few use cases so that they can sort of prove it out. But there are other companies that are using it substantially. So we bake a lot of the AI ML into our underlying products. Our automation model, we said, look, you can invest in RPA. You'll basically be building a system next to your system to automate things, and you'll spend amount of money to get an improvement around that. We baked our artificial intelligence so that our automation learns. And what it means is, for the same investment, not only do you get the automation, but it also starts to benchmark and automate and make recommendations for changes next. So your system learns and gets better over time with the same investment. So I think the nature of that spend and the quality of that spend is still an important discussion to have very early on in those initiatives.
And fundamentally, I think ROI comes down to, are you driving revenue and profitability? It's like, that is the ultimate measure of ROI.
Right. Did you make more money? Did you spend less money? And did you make the world a better place?
Yeah. And did you de-risk the business? Because the one thing we didn't touch base on that's still getting a lot of money is investments in cybersecurity and business risk. And again, that's a thing you can spend an infinite amount of money on. The idea is to spend it wisely so that you're truly spending your money where it's going to make the most impact on reducing your business risk. And I look at the amount of
Lost Trent.
Looks like Trent had a risky connection.
Yeah, but I think
attacks on things like ransomware and denial of service attacks and becoming a big investment. I'm still here?
Yep.
Yeah.
We lost you for a sec.
Okay. So all I was saying is that from a business risk perspective, I think it's attracting a lot more attention. The quality of that spend is important. So you can spend an infinite amount of money, but if you focus on the things that reduce your business risk, most importantly, that's a big area, particularly with ransomware, denial of service, and other security aspects. We're seeing a lot more focus on zero trust environments and how I build trust to make that part of my proposition to my customers.
Yep. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap, and we can have a separate session on risk and security, or a separate 300 sessions on that. But I want to thank you guys. I think your insights and the perspective you shared was fantastic. To those who have stayed over time in the audience, we really appreciate your joining. If you'd like to connect with Trent or Nigel, feel free to just send me an email. We're going to send a thank you email out to everybody with a link to the recording. That's a good way to get back at me if you need anything. But thanks, everyone. I hope you're all safe and healthy. Trent and Nigel, really appreciate your time, and I hope everyone has a great day.